Hello and welcome. Today let's talk about the patterns of gene inheritance, and we'll talk a lot about Mr. Gregor Mendel. Now, Gregor Mendel, we'll go through and we'll talk about, was an Austrian monk, and he formulated a few laws, so we'll go through and we'll check out his laws as well. Now, when we talk the science of genetics, I'd like you to know the science of genetics explains the process of inheritance and also why there are variations between offspring from one generation to the next. Every culture in history has tried to explain inheritance patterns. Understanding these patterns is very important for medicine. It's also very important for agriculture, and it's very important for animal husbandry, or you can say the science of animal breeding. Our modern understanding, our modern understanding of genetics is going to be based on the work of Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk. He was an Austrian monk who developed the basic principles of inheritance in the late 1860s. His parents were farmers, and he was a mathematician himself. He was a mathematician who used pea plants. He used pea plants as his experimental organisms. He concluded that plants transmitted distinct factors to their offspring. We now know that the factors that control traits are called genes. They are called genes. And genes are found on chromosomes. Now we talk chromosomes. Chromosomes in pea plants and humans are going to be found as pairs. They're going to come in a pair. And they're going to be referred to as homologous chromosomes, or we can refer to them as homologs. Homologous structures are going to be structures that are anatomically similar, and they are inherited from a common ancestor. One member of the pair is going to be inherited from mom, and the other is going to come from dad. Homologous chromosomes have the same length, and they have the same centromere location, and they're going to be similar in the types of genes that they contain. Alternate forms of a gene or a trait are going to be called alleles. So when we talk about alleles, I'd like you to know that alleles are going to be a variant. They are a variant form of a given gene, or we can say they are an alternate form of a gene for the same trait. And they are called, again, alleles. So an alternate form of a gene for a trait is going to be called an allele. For example, one chromosome can have a gene for long fingers, and the other can have a gene for short fingers. Alleles are always at the same spot, or we can say at the same locus, on each member of the homologous pair of chromosomes. A locus is going to be a particular position, you can say, a particular point, you can say, or a particular place on the chromosome. Here in this figure, we can see we have a picture of a red chromosome and a picture of a blue chromosome. The letters now on the homologous chromosomes, they stand for certain alleles. So here you can see you've got a capital G and a lowercase g. This capital G is an allele for this lowercase g. And vice versa. You can say the lowercase g is an allele of the capital G. This capital R we can see here is an allele of this lowercase r, and vice versa. You can never say that this capital G is going to be an allele for this R or this R, because they are going to be at different loci and they're going to govern different traits. Mendel concluded that pea plants have two factors for every trait. For example, if we're talking stem length, one factor could be for a long stem length, and the other could be for a short stem length. He observed that one of the factors controlling the same trait can be dominant over the other, which is then considered recessive. Therefore, a tall pea plant could have one factor for a long stem and another for a short stem, as we mentioned. Now, the offspring for such pea plants were tall and short. He reasoned this would be possible if the gametes contained only one factor for each trait. Mendel formulated his first law, which is the law of segregation. Mendel had no knowledge of chromosomes, but he decided, based on his observations, that the following were true. Number one, he states that each pea plant has two factors for each trait. Number two, he states the factors they segregate or they separate during the formation of the gametes. And number three, the law states that each gamete contains only one factor from each pair of factors. And number four, it states fertilization is going to give each new individual two factors for each trait. Fertilization is when the egg and the sperm come together. So fertilization gives each new individual two factors for each trait. All right, next then let's talk about the inheritance of a single trait. First here, I'd like to talk to you about the term phenotype. The term phenotype describes either an individual's physical characteristics or microscopic and metabolic characteristics. Here in this figure, we can see we are going to use traits of hairline and finger length in our examples. Both of these traits are going to have variations in their phenotypes, which are going to be determined by the combination of alleles that one is going to inherit. So next then let's look at the term genotype. Next then let's talk genotype. Now when we talk genotype, the genotype refers to the alleles the chromosomes carry that are responsible for the trait, or we can say the phenotype. In diploid organisms like us, we'll see a pair of homologous chromosomes are going to contain two alleles for each trait, one on each member of the pair. Mendel suggested using letters. He suggested using letters to indicate these different factors, which we now call alleles. A capital letter is going to indicate a dominant allele, and a lowercase letter is going to indicate a recessive allele. Dominant means alleles will mask the expression of the recessive allele. That's what dominant allele means. Now, when working with alleles for hairline, we will represent the dominant allele of widow's peak with a capital W. So the dominant allele of a widow's peak is going to be assigned a capital W. And the recessive allele of a straight hairline is going to be assigned a lowercase w. So in the case of a single trait, there are three possible combinations of the two alleles, right? We can have two capital W's, we can have a capital W and a lowercase w, or we can have two lowercase w's. Now, likewise for finger length, short fingers is going to be the dominant allele, which is represented by the capital S, whereas long fingers is the recessive allele, and it's going to be represented with a lowercase s. So again, in the case of a single trait, like for example hairline or finger length, there are going to be three possible combinations of the two alleles. You can have a capital W, capital W, lowercase w, or two lowercase w's. These are considered the possible genotypes for this trait. If the two members of the allelic pair are the same, the individual is said to be homozygous. They're said to be homozygous. Now, both capital W and lowercase w, they're both considered homozygous. Capital W is considered homozygous dominant, and then lowercase w is considered homozygous recessive. Now, if the two members of the allelic pair are different, then the individual is considered heterozygous. Then they're considered heterozygous. And we can see that here when we have a genotype of a capital W and a lowercase w. And you can see this is the only heterozygous genotype that we have. And here then we can appreciate the phenotypes. Let's see the phenotypes. Now, when an organism has a capital W, it exhibits the dominant phenotype regardless of whether the other allele is going to be a capital W or a lowercase w. Now here we can see both genotypes, capital W, and capital W, lowercase w, they exhibit the dominant phenotype, which is a widow's peak. The only time the recessive phenotype, which is the straight hairline, is going to be expressed is if the genotype is homozygous recessive. Or we can say lowercase w, lowercase w. So we see the same thing here. Capital W in the genotype indicates the widow's peak. The lowercase w's, straight hairline. And we're talking finger length. We said short fingers are indicated by the capital S. Long fingers, the recessive allele, small s, a small s. All right, next then let's check out one trait crosses. So let's check out crosses between parents in relation to one trait, and then afterwards we'll move on to two different traits. Now here, let's talk. If a homozygous man, so they're telling us homozygous man, now we know homozygous, this means the same. So the genotype's going to be the same. If a homozygous man with a widow's peak, so they're already giving us all this information, we should already be processing this in our mind. Homozygous with a widow's peak, we know widow's peak is a capital W. So homozygous with a widow's peak, that's telling us that this individual is going to have the same genotype. It's going to be a capital W and a capital W. If that man was to reproduce with a female, with a woman who has a straight hairline. So if we know straight hairline, and we've got female down, right? Straight hairline, we know, homozygous, recessive. So we're going to have lowercase w's. So here you can see lowercase w's, two lowercase w's, representing the straight hairline. Now, here when we talk the male we know is homozygous. So homozygous, that's telling us now that this genotype cannot be a capital W and a lowercase w. That would be considered then heterozygous, we've already determined. So a homozygous man with a widow's peak. So that's telling us homozygous dominant genotype was to reproduce with a woman with a straight hairline. Straight hairline, we know automatically, lowercase w is going to represent the straight hairline. So that is represented by two lowercase w's. Now, what type of hairline will their children have? So if these two individuals were to reproduce, what type of hairline will their children have? In order to solve this, then, what we'll do is we'll move over to this image here. This image is going to help us determine that. The next slide shows us the different steps that we'll take in an orderly fashion. So here first, what we'll do is we need to determine the genotype of each parent. We need to first determine the genotype of each parent. Second, then, we need to be able to list the possible gametes for each parent. Now here, we've kind of already done that in our minds, right? Then we're going to combine all the gametes, and then we're going to determine the genotypes and the phenotypes of all the offspring. So here we can see we've got the parents, okay? We've determined their genotypes. So here we've determined the parents' genotypes, and then we're going to list the possible gametes that each parent can give off to the kids. So if this parent here has two capital W's, they can give off one capital W. If this parent here has two lowercase w's, they're going to be able to give off one lowercase w. So here then we've listed the possible gametes for each parent. Then step 3 is we can combine all the different possible gametes. And then 4, we're able to determine the genotypes and then the phenotypes of the offspring. So the offspring, you can see, is going to have a capital W coming from dad and lowercase w coming from mom. And so this we see is a heterozygous genotype. And this heterozygous genotype is going to give the patient a widow's peak because this capital W is there. That's representing the dominant genes. So next in here, when writing a heterozygous genotype, as we did here, capital W and a lowercase w, always put the capital letter first. Always put the capital letter first. So here, each parent has only one type of gamete in regards to hairline, and therefore the offspring have similar genotypes and phenotypes. The children are, we said, heterozygous. They have a genotype that is a capital W and a lowercase w, and their phenotype is, it's representing a widow's peak. Now, these children are monohybrids. They are monohybrids. That means they are heterozygous for only one pair of alleles. Let's see what happens if they mate with others of the same genotype. Now, this is going to be an example of a monohybrid cross. A monohybrid cross. So when we talk about an example of a monohybrid cross, this would be an example of a monohybrid cross where you can see a parent that's a capital W and a lowercase w is going to reproduce with another parent who is also capital W, lowercase w. So two heterozygous individuals mating with each other. So here now in this heterozygous parent, you can see each parent has two possible types of gametes, a capital W and a lowercase w, and a capital W and a lowercase w. So let's look at this monohybrid cross. Let's perform this monohybrid cross. One way to figure out the genotype and then eventually the phenotype of the offspring is going to be by us using a Punnett square, as we see here in this picture. The Punnett square can be used to determine the offspring genotype and phenotype. Now the Punnett square, here what we'll do is we're going to have to ensure that all possible types of sperm are going to be lined up vertically, and all possible types of oocytes are lined up horizontally, or vice versa. We just have to keep everything organized. And here we're going to be able to see every possible combination of gametes within the squares. So here, let's switch images. Here we can see it a little bit better. So the parents, they're monohybrids, they're heterozygous. You can see here. And here we've lined up the sperm. So the father has got a capital W and a lowercase w, and mom has capital W and a lowercase w. So here now, one of the possible offspring genotypes can be capital W, which comes from dad, and another capital W, which comes from mom. Another offspring we can see here can get a capital W from mom and a lowercase w from dad, making this individual now heterozygous compared to this homozygous dominant offspring that we talked about first. Another offspring, a third possibility we see here, is a lowercase w coming from mom and a capital W coming from dad. So this is also another heterozygous genotype, as we saw before. Now the fourth possible offspring we can see here will be an offspring that takes one lowercase w from mom and another lowercase w from dad. So this genotype of this offspring is going to be homozygous recessive, lowercase w and a lowercase w. So now here, since we've determined the genotypes, we can start looking at the phenotypes. So we know this genotype, capital W, this individual's phenotype is going to be a widow's peak. Capital W here as well, widow's peak. Capital W, widow's peak. No capital W, no widow's peak. So one straight hairline we have. So again, after determining the genotypes and the phenotypes, we can determine now what we call the genotypic and phenotypic ratios. Now here, the genotypic ratio, I'd like you to know, is going to be, you can see we have one offspring that has this heterozygous dominant genotype. So we would write the genotypic ratio as we see here. 1, we're going to have capital W, right? 2, capital W, and lowercase w's. 2, 1, homozygous recessive, which is lowercase w and lowercase w. So that would be the genotypic ratio. Again, 1, capital W, which is homozygous, dominant we got from here, right? To 2, heterozygous offspring, which are marked here. 2, then our 1, homozygous recessive, which we see right in here. So now if we talk phenotypic ratios, here we can see phenotypic ratios. Now in our phenotypic ratios, we have 3 individuals, you can see here, 1, 2, 3 individuals that will have a widow's peak, and our 1 individual that will not have a widow's peak, that will have a straight hairline. Next, then let's move forward. So 1 trait crosses, then again, after determining the genotypes and the phenotypes of the offspring from the Punnett square analysis, a tally then is performed. So the genotypic ratio we can see is 1, homozygous dominant offspring, 2, heterozygous offspring, and 1, homozygous recessive offspring, or we can say 1 to 2 to 1. Now again, the phenotypic ratio we just saw was 3 individuals with widow's peaks, so 3 widow's peaks, and 1 straight hairline, or 3 to 1. 3 individuals have a widow's peak because they carry at least 1 dominant allele, which is that capital W. Now we can see here the chance of 2 or more independent events occurring together is the product of their chance of occurring separately. That's the product rule of probability. Now in the cross, capital W, lowercase w, mating with capital W, lowercase w, what is the chance of obtaining either a capital W or a lowercase w from a parent? We can calculate. Now the chances of getting a capital W is equal to half, and the chance of getting a lowercase w is also half. Now let's look at the probability of having these genotypes. Now the chance of having a homozygous dominant genotype is going to be half times half, which is going to be equal to a quarter, 25% chance. Right, that's what we saw. Now the chance of having a heterozygous genotype where the dominant allele came from dad and the recessive allele came from mom, the chances there you can see are half times half is a quarter chance. And then the chances of getting this recessive allele from dad and the dominant allele from mom is again half times half, which is going to be a quarter chance. And then the chance of getting both homozygous recessive alleles is going to be half times half, which is also equal to a quarter. So you have a 25% chance of getting this genotype, or you have a 25% chance of getting this genotype, or you have a 25% chance of getting this genotype, where we've got the recessive allele from dad, dominant allele from mom, right? Here we got the recessive allele from mom, and we got the dominant allele from dad. And then here, 25% chance of developing this genotype where we have both recessive alleles, one coming from each parent. Now, if we were to check out this genotype and this genotype, the phenotype is going to be the same. The phenotype is going to be the same. So that's why you can see here we have 3 with a widow's peak. So the genotypic ratio we got there. And here we can see the probability then of having any of these different genotypes. All right, next then let's check out the sum rule of probability. The sum rule of probability, it states that the chance of an event can occur in more than one way is the sum of the individual chances. To calculate the chance of an offspring having a widow's peak, we're going to add the chances of a capital W, lowercase w, or lowercase w, capital W, or lowercase w. So the chance of a widow's peak is going to be a quarter plus a quarter plus a quarter, which is equal to 3/4 or 75% chance that the offspring will have a widow's peak. So here with this genotype, add it to this genotype, and this genotype, which all represent widow's peak, we can see 3 out of the 4 total possibilities will have widow's peaks. Now the chances of a straight hairline is going to be 1/4 or 25% chance because, right, just 1 out of the 4 total possibilities is going to have a straight hairline, which is this individual that has the genotype lowercase w, which is again a homozygous recessive genotype. Next, then let's check out the inheritance of 2 traits. Let's check out the inheritance of 2 traits then. Now, when we talk 2 trait crosses, let's review here. Homologous chromosomes are going to be inherited as a pair, one member from each parent, and each has similar length and similar genes. Very important there. During meiosis, each gamete is going to receive one member of each pair of homologs. Now, the homologs are going to separate independently. It does not matter which member of a pair goes into which gamete. Now, last here, we can assume that the alleles for the 2 genes are on these homologs in the following examples that we're going to go through and we're going to check out. Next here, we're going to look at the law of independent assortment. Now, Mendel, I want you to recall, had no knowledge of meiosis, but he realized his results were attainable only if the sperm and the eggs contained every possible combination of factors. Now, this gave rise to then the law of independent assortment, where you can see he says that each pair of factors assorts independently without regard to how the others are going to separate. Next, he says all possible combinations of factors can occur in the gametes. Here we can see a 2 trait or a dihybrid cross is going to be used to test the law of independent assortment. Now, our example cross will be a person who's homozygous for a widow's peak and short fingers. So homozygous for a widow's peak, we know capital W. And then also short fingers, we know capital S. And here we've got capital S. And this person then is going to reproduce with the person who has a straight hairline and long fingers. Now, their genotype we can see straight hairline, lowercase w, long fingers, lowercase s. Now, the cross is going to be capital W, capital S, mating with or reproducing with lowercase w, lowercase s. So let's look at the gametes then. Here we can see, according to the law of segregation, the gametes for capital W, capital S, parent is going to be a capital W that they can pass on and a capital S they can pass on. So here you can see the gametes. Now the gametes for the lowercase w, lowercase s, that parent, they have to be a lowercase w and a lowercase s. So that we can see there. Now the offspring will all have the same genotype. capital W, capital S, lowercase s. Now, all offspring will have the same phenotype, widow's peak and short fingers, right? That's what we're going to see here. This phenotype is called a dihybrid because the individual is heterozygous for both hairline and finger length. So let's check that out. So in the P generation, the parent generation, we said we had a parent that was capital W, capital S, and that parent you can see is homozygous dominant, and they're going to mate or reproduce with a parent who's also homozygous but recessive. And their genotype is a lowercase w, lowercase s. So this parent is going to give its offspring a capital W and a capital S. This parent is going to give lowercase w, lowercase s. So let's check that out right inside of here. And you can see the P gametes have exactly that. So here now we can see when these gametes come together in fertilization, the offspring, then the F1 generation, is going to be an offspring that has the genotype capital W, which came from here, lowercase w, you can see here, capital S, here, lowercase s, which came from here. So their genotype is capital W, capital S, lowercase s. And again, they all have widow's peak, and we said short fingers. And you can see that here very well. Look at this parent here has long fingers. This parent has the short fingers. So the short fingers you can see came from this parent. And then the widow's peak also from this parent as well. Now let's see here if this F1 generation, now in the next generation, the dihybrid, that F1 generation offspring that has this genotype of capital W, capital S, lowercase s, if they were to reproduce with another dihybrid, what gametes are possible? Now the law of segregation states that each gamete gets only one letter of each kind. Okay, the law of independent assortment states that all combinations are possible. So here, if we were to look at this, now the offspring here would have, you can see, so let's look at one possible type of combination can be capital W and a capital S, which we see right inside of here. The next possible combination we can have is a capital W and a lowercase s. So capital W and a lowercase s. Now the third type we can have is a lowercase w and a capital S. One possible type. So lowercase w and a capital S. And then the fourth possible type we can have is this lowercase w and a lowercase s. So lowercase w and a lowercase s. So all the different types of combinations that are possible. So here then, we can see now if this F1 generation mates with somebody else with the same exact genotype. So here we can see all the possible genotypes, capital W, capital S, capital W, lowercase s, lowercase w, capital S, lowercase w, lowercase s, and then same thing here with the other parent. So here now, when these two combinations come together, they're going to give this genotype here, capital W, capital S, and a capital S. So here we can see that. Now this possible combination we can see here. Now this next possible combination we can see here is capital W, and then here you got capital W and a lowercase s, and a lowercase s. Now this third one we can see here, we've got capital W and a lowercase w, capital S, and another capital S. So capital W, lowercase w, capital S. Now the fourth possible combination we can see here, capital W, capital S, lowercase s, right inside of there. Now the next possible type we can have, the fifth one, you can see capital W, lowercase s, capital S. And then here, capital W, lowercase s, lowercase s. And then here we can see capital W, lowercase w, capital S, lowercase s. Now here the 8th possible genotype, capital W, lowercase s, lowercase s. 9th possible type, capital W, lowercase w, capital S, capital S. 10th, you can see we have 16 different types. The 10th possible type, capital W, lowercase w, capital S, lowercase s. Now here the 11th type you can see, lowercase w, capital S, capital S. So we can see that there. And again, we're going to look at all the phenotypes for each of these as well. And here with the 12th possible type, lowercase w's, capital S, and a lowercase s. And then here you can see 13th possible type, capital W, lowercase w, capital S, and a lowercase s. And here capital W, lowercase s, lowercase s. And then here you can see 15th type, lowercase w, and then capital S, lowercase s. And the 16th type, lowercase w, capital S, lowercase s. So if we were to write the genotypic ratios, right, we would put all these genotypes that are similar to one another into the same categories and then come up with the different genotypic ratios. So if we're to look at all the different genotypic ratios, you can see all the various types that we can have there. And when we talk phenotypic ratios, here you can appreciate the phenotypic ratios. Now again, the allelic key you can see here, if we have a capital W, that will equal a widow's peak. If we have a lowercase w, that equals a straight hairline. And then if we have a capital S, that equals short fingers. Lowercase s equals long fingers. And then here the phenotypic ratio now is telling us we're going to have 9 offspring out of these 16 that we have here. 9 are going to have a widow's peak and short fingers. 3 will have a widow's peak and long fingers. 3 will have a straight hairline with short fingers. And 1 is going to have a straight hairline and long fingers. So we can see that same thing right inside of here. So the phenotypic ratio we can see is 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. And that's always going to be expected for a dihybrid cross when simple dominance is going to be present. So same thing we see right in here. It's nice and color coordinated, you can see for you as well. They're using like a light yellow and then a purple in a few of these, and then you've got like a pinkish, and then here it's like a green. All right, awesome.